Siblings in Christ, I am Cynthia Moore Kokoy, and I have the honor of serving as the resident bishop of the Eastern Pennsylvania and Greater New Jersey annual conferences. On behalf of the Regionalization Strategy Committee, let me express my profound gratitude that you accepted the invitation to attend this training event. This event is designed to give you the tools you will need to begin or to intensify your annual conference's efforts to garner as many votes as possible to ratify the Regionalization constitutional amendments. The Regionalization Strategy Committee, which organized this event, represents a collaboration among the Council of Bishops, the Connectional Table, the Standing Committee on Central Conferences, UMCom, and some writers of the original Christmas Covenant. This strategy committee, which I have the honor of facilitating, has already held similar training events in Southern Africa, Western Africa, and the Philippines. We are so grateful to GBGM and many private donors who made those in-person training events possible. Now, following those training events, UMCom and members of the Regionalization Strategy Committee have been in constant communication with those who were trained and are providing them with ongoing information and resources. Those persons who attended those trainings and have been receiving ongoing information have expressed their deep gratitude for the information and support they have received. The Strategy Committee also has provided regionalization resources for our siblings in Europe and has been assured by the European members of the Strategy Committee that they will let us know if any further training is needed. So you can see why we are so excited to provide this training event that is specifically designed to address U.S. contextual issues around the passage of regionalization. Today, you will hear from Dr. David Scott, who will share a theological framework for regionalization. Reverend Dr. Elise Fulbright is going to provide you with information about the process of ratification. Heather Hahn and Taylor Burton Edwards will share practical implications for the passage of regionalization. And Joe Iovino will provide you with some resources for action. Now, if you have any questions during any of the presentations, please submit your questions during that presentation. There will also be a question and answer session at the conclusion of all of the presentations. Again, we'll try to answer as many questions as time allows. Now, siblings, if you have been multitasking during this introduction, I need your undivided attention now. It is our hope that you will use the information that is shared today to develop and execute a strategy that will ensure an overwhelming vote in your annual conference affirming the regionalization amendments. We encourage you to think about the already established effective conference, district, and local church communication structures that you can utilize to get information about regionalization and the urgency of its passage as close to the grassroots as possible. We want you to think about how you can get every retired pastor and every lay equalization member present when your annual conference takes this vote. We are confident that you'll be able to do this because we asked your bishop to invite 2 persons from your annual conference who have the skills, the annual conference clout, and the passion needed to take what is shared today and translate it into action. You were one of the 2. the Regionalization Strategy Committee, and all of those persons who've already been trained in Africa and the Philippines are depending on you to collaborate with others to develop and act on a plan that will get regionalization amendments passed. So won't you now join me in a word of prayer? Almighty and most gracious God, we love you so much. We are grateful for your grace and for your mercy. We're grateful for the ways in which you have resourced us so that we might connect one with the other. And in particular, today, we are grateful for your Sophia wisdom. We're grateful for the fact that you have so graciously decided you will share that wisdom with us and allow us to be wise as serpents, as we are gentle as doves. So God, open our minds, our hearts, our capacity to reason to you, so that we might receive today all of the information that you have to give to us, so that we might today begin to discern how we might use that information in order to bring about the passage of regionalization. We believe it is your will for the United Methodist Church. And so, God, help this to be one more step in making it so. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. As United Methodists, our goal is always to have our polity arise out of our understanding of who God is and how God wants us to be in the world. Therefore, it is my pleasure to introduce to some and present to others Dr. David Scott. Dr. Scott is the Director of Mission Theology at the General Board of Global Ministries. He's an author, professor, and blogger. Today, he's going to share with us the theology of regionalization.
Hello, my name is Dr. David W. Scott. I serve as the Senior Director of Theology and Strategic Planning for the General Boards of Global Ministries and Higher Education and Ministry. I'm here to talk to you today about the theological grounding for regionalization. In doing so, I want to talk about taking 3 steps together, moving from where we are now as the United Methodist Church to where God is calling us to go, and then to how we will get from where we are now to where God is calling us to go. Where we are now as a church is U.S.-centric in many ways. That is, as a denominational whole, the church tends to focus on those members and those parts of the church in the United States. And here are some facts associated with that U.S. centrism. In terms of attitudes, U.S. United Methodists often fail to see or treat our fellow United Methodists from elsewhere as equals. And if we need proof of this, we can listen to some of the stories that our Central Conference sisters and brothers can tell us about their experiences in denomination-wide settings. The agendas of denomination-wide bodies often reflect primarily U.S. concerns. Just look at the percentage of General Conference petitions that come from the United States versus from elsewhere. In terms of focus, many of the structures of the denomination focus primarily on the church in the United States, even when they are ostensibly denomination-wide and do work internationally. As an example, we could look at the percentage of cases the Judicial Council hears that come from the United States versus from elsewhere. 99% of denominational finances come from the United States, and not all areas of the world contribute to apportionments at the same rates or to the same funds. Granted, there are significant economic differences between regions of the church, and we need to be cognizant of these, but that does not fully explain away this disparity. The denomination operates according to rules developed in the United States that reflect American cultural values. Robert's Rules of Order are the most obvious example. And United Methodists from the United States are often proportionally overrepresented on denomination-wide bodies. With less than half the global membership currently, they tend to have much more than half the members of most denomination-wide groups. There's a long history behind this U.S. centrism. In some ways, it is rooted in the success of the evangelistic mission of American Methodists who shared their faith in countries around the world. In some ways, it stems from the theological and cultural prejudices of previous generations of Methodists. In some ways, it reflects the significant secular economic and political power that the United States has as a country. The important thing to emphasize is that there are differences in how the UMC's current structures and practices treat United Methodists in the United States versus United Methodists from other countries. I would suggest that these facts about our U.S.-centric nature as a denomination point to underlying problems with U.S. centrism. One problem with the difference between the United States and the rest of the Church is that by treating different areas of the Church differently, we privilege the United States by giving it more power and control of resources. Therefore, U.S. centrism is not fair or equitable. Those inequalities are also a problem for Christian fellowship. We believe that all Christians are equal before God. How can United Methodists from different contexts join in true Christian fellowship when they are not treated as equals? There are also practical problems. Under the current setup, the United States serves as the template for the rest of the Church. But what works in the United States won't necessarily work elsewhere, since laws, access to resources, and cultural norms are different around the world. As Jose Miguel Benino, the Argentinian Methodist theologian, once said, rules and structures designed for a church of 10 million won't work for a church of 10,000. These differences are also a potential problem for the church's evangelistic witness. When the church is not adequately able to adapt to its context, it will not be able to address important issues related to the witness of the church in that context. But there is hope. If U.S. centrism is a problem in the church, then God will provide solutions. In fact, God may offer the church multiple different ways to move forward, and the church may use multiple different ways to move toward a better expression of church. As we consider possible solutions to these problems, our goals should include preserving our connection to one another. For United Methodists, connectionalism is the term we use to talk about what it means to be the church together. When we're talking about where God is calling the United Methodist Church to go, we are asking, how is God calling us to better live out our connectionalism? Some people and some groups have already left the UMC or are in the process of doing so. The work of shaping the future of the UMC belongs to those of us who have decided to stay and be UMC, and to our ecumenical Methodist partners with whom we have official, recognized, and in most cases long-standing relationships. The work ahead of us is work for those who are committed to being in connection to one another. As we think about what sort of connectionalism God is calling the United Methodist Church to embody, we need to be aware of the different senses in which the term can be understood. This includes a structural meaning of connectionalism, where we talk about the formal polity of the denomination, its conferences, episcopal leadership, itineration, the agencies, and so on. While this form of connectionalism is what people often think of first, it's not the only meaning of connectionalism. Connectionalism is also a set of relationships between people who know one another and have eaten, prayed, worked, talked, and traveled with one another. But there's even more. As Christians, we believe that we are sisters and brothers in Christ, whether or not we have ever met. This is a spiritual sense of connectionalism. Finally, connectionalism has an ecclesiological sense. There's something important about the nature of the church that only exists in the connections between local congregations. Congregations need one another to fully be the body of Christ. With these four senses of connectionalism in mind, I'd like to suggest that God is calling us as a denomination to live into a connectionalism that embodies the following qualities. First, it is missional. Connectionalism exists to serve mission, and mission cannot exist without connectionalism. Second, it is mutual. Mutual connectional relationships depend upon investment from all parties, give and take by each party, and benefit for all parties. Third, it is decolonial. It must actively address historic injustices related to empire, nation, race, gender, class, ability, and other forms of privilege. Fourth, it is contextual. Understandings and practices of connectionalism vary across contexts, and this is a normal and healthy reality that supports missional effectiveness. Fifth, it is intercultural. Connectionalism must put us in dialogue with each other across difference for the sake of mutual learning and collective discernment. Sixth, and finally, it is open. As United Methodists, we may expect, even demand, that the Church continue to change and grow for the sake of better loving God and neighbor. This is a theological vision of what God is calling us to be as a church, how God is calling us to live into our connectionalism. So, U.S. centrism is a problem in the United Methodist Church, and God is calling us to a better connectionalism. The way we get from one to the other is the solutions God offers us as a church. One very important such solution right now is regionalization. Regionalization is one way, but an important way, to move away from U.S. centrism and toward the type of connectional values that God is calling us to practice. It's important to make a distinction between regionalization as a theological concept and the worldwide regionalization legislation. I'll talk about both. As a theological concept, regionalization affirms that the primary venue for making collective decisions for the church should be a regional level rather than a global or local level. Regionalization is a value that affirms that all parts of the church should have equal authority and equal ability to make decisions. Regionalization is related to other theological concepts, such as contextualization. Contextualization asserts that the practices of the church should be determined within a shared context, so as to best fit that context. For both regionalization and contextualization, there are differing levels of local and regional contexts. We could talk, for instance, about the local context of Basel and the regional contexts of Switzerland, Central Europe, and Europe as a whole. What decisions are made on what level is a question of polity. There already is one form of regionalization in United Methodist polity. The Book of Discipline refers to annual conferences as the fundamental bodies of the church. Annual conferences are a form of regionalization in the church. They bring together churches from across a region for collective decision-making in a way that goes beyond the local, but does not include everyone from the global. The issue in our current U.S. centrism is that this is not a sufficient form of regionalization. As a package of legislation, worldwide regionalization seeks to implement the concept of regionalization in one way within the United Methodist Church. The worldwide regionalization legislation proposes to change the names of the existing central conferences into regional conferences. It would also create a new U.S. regional conference, enabling the United Methodist Church in the United States to decide on specific U.S. matters. Central conferences are an already existing form of regionalization. The worldwide regionalization legislation would standardize this form of regionalization to include the United States, which currently does not have an equivalent form of regionalization to the central conferences. This is one of the major drivers of the problem of U.S. centrism. Once created, each regional conference will have the authority to maximize the effectiveness of its mission and ministry in its context by adapting portions of the Book of Discipline. All regional conferences will share the same common portions of the Book of Discipline, including the Constitution, the doctrinal standards in our theological task, the ministry of all Christians, and the social principles enacted by General Conference. These are not adaptable by regional conferences. The Council of Bishops, Judicial Council, General Agencies, and General Conference are fully maintained. The important thing to affirm is that the worldwide regionalization legislation is based on regionalization as a theological concept. In addition to discussing the merits of that legislation, it's also important to better understand the theological concept of regionalization, which is where this presentation comes in. I want to offer 4 affirmations about regionalization as a theological principle. That regionalization has a biblical foundation, that regionalization is missional, that regionalization is equitable, and that regionalization is connectional. Together, these 4 affirmations aim to give a better sense of what the theological concept of regionalization is and why it matters. Let's first look briefly at the affirmation that regionalization has a biblical foundation. Throughout the Bible, God has recognized the diversity of cultures and nations, included that diversity in God's redemptive plans for humanity, and allowed for decision-making structures that take such diversity into account. In this way, the theme of regionalization runs throughout the Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, we see in the Psalms and the prophets that God intends for all nations to one day know and worship God. This will not happen, though, because cultural and political differences among nations are erased. Rather, each nation, with its unique heritage, will worship God through its own culture or cultures and under its own leadership. So, there is international connectionalism and regionalization of worship and leadership in that theological vision. We also see in the history of the 12 tribes of Israel intertribal connectionalism, united around a shared faith and history. This connectionalism was paired with regional decision-making by elders within each tribe. Turning to the New Testament, we see repeatedly in such verses as Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20, Acts chapter 2, Acts chapters 10 and 11, and Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 through 10, that, just like in the Hebrew Bible, God includes all nations in God's salvific vision and intends for them to keep their own unique culture or cultures as part of that vision. Moreover, in the early church, there was a spiritual and relational unity among the churches, along with local and regional decision-making by leaders of churches and groups of churches throughout the Greco-Roman, Persian, and African lands. Next, let's explore how regionalization is missional. As I said earlier, regionalization is tied to contextualization, which is one of the major insights from the past half-century in the theology of mission. Mission theology has shifted away from an understanding of mission that equates Christianity with Western culture toward an understanding of mission that recognizes that all cultures are equally valid homes for the gospel. This insight extends across mainline Protestant, evangelical Protestant, and Catholic theologians. The emphasis on contextualization in mission theology recognizes that no culture can claim superiority over other cultures in the Christian faith, just as no region can claim superiority over others. Indeed, it is an obstacle to the gospel to insist that all Christians follow the practices of one culture or one region. Instead, when Christianity adapts to the culture of various nations and lands, then it flourishes. By giving decision-making authority to those most familiar with their cultural context, regional governance allows the church in every context to better engage with the culture around it in appropriate ways. Shared belief and practices continue to unite Christians across cultural differences, even when those beliefs and practices are expressed using terms, symbols, and concepts indigenous to each culture. Again, regionalization is equitable. It moves away from a center-periphery understanding of the church. The United States is no longer treated as the center and template for others. Instead, regionalization recognizes that the church in each country, including the United States, is an adaptation of United Methodism to the particular context of that country. Each adaptation of United Methodism must reflect on its own context, as together they dialogue about what it means to be United Methodist across contexts. Under regionalization, each region governs itself,
이지역화에
and
있어서
each region contributes equally to the governance of the whole. And all regions build relationships of mutuality with each other, grounded in equity, reciprocity, and trust. Regionalization emphasizes the adaptation of the church to the various contexts in which it operates, but regionalization is not separation. It's simply a way for the United Methodist Church to live into its connectional identity. As history shows, and I'll say more about this momentarily, the quest to balance regionalization, connectionalism, and autonomy is long-standing. These theological concepts are not mutually exclusive. Instead, they reinforce one another. Together, United Methodists across nations and cultures can discern how to support one another in carrying out, in our own contexts, our shared mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. So, while we have some problems in our church, including the problem of U.S. centrism, God provides us with solutions to our problems, and regionalization is one important such solution in the problem of U.S. centrism. There's more good news, though. I believe we are currently in a period in which God has opened up the possibility of change in our church. We are in a kairos moment. Kairos is God's appointed time. It is a time when the possibility for successful collective action exists. To borrow language from the political science term of policy window, it is when a problem, a solution, and the will to implement that solution line up. We have a problem, U.S. centrism. We have a solution, regionalization. And I believe that we have the will to implement that solution in this moment. Our current Kairos time is the latest in a long line of Kairos moments throughout UMC history, as the Church has repeatedly encouraged God's invitation to live into new and more equitable ways of being the connectional Church together across geographic borders. From the 1790s through the 1810s, the system of a general conference and regional annual conferences evolved. The first General Conference was held in 1792, and in 1812 the Methodist Episcopal Church began the present system of electing delegates from annual conferences to the General Conference. In the 1830s and 40s, the first American Methodist International Missions offered the first chance to develop equitable relationships and structures across international boundaries. The Church decided that annual conferences would be established everywhere Methodist mission went, not just in the United States. In the 1870s, the first central conferences were created in India and elsewhere in Asia to allow for more coordination among annual conferences outside the United States. Eventually, central conferences led to leadership selection and adaptation of church practices on a regional level outside the United States. In the 1920s, there was discussion of how the church in the United States should relate to the church in Korea, Mexico, and Brazil, where the church was pursuing autonomy. In this period, central conferences were also extended around the world, almost, but not quite, including to the United States. The 1960s and 70s brought Cosmos, the Commission on the Structure of Methodism Overseas, and a wave of churches in Latin America and Asia becoming autonomous. I want to talk a little bit more about the Cosmos process as an example of how the church approached a Kairos moment in the past. Cosmos was designed to address issues of the relationship between the Methodist Church in the United States and the Methodist Church in other countries. In doing so, it was intended to balance the principles of freedom and fellowship. Cosmos focused on 5 core principles that should determine the relationship between the church in different contexts. 1. Developing responsible indigenous churches of integrity. 2. Being shaped by the centrality of mission. 3. Fostering interdependence in mission and fellowship. 4. Being considered provisional and thus flexible. And 5. Providing for equality of relationship. Based on these principles, Cosmos developed 4 options for the structure of the church. The first was continuing the present structure, including central conferences. The second was granting autonomy for churches outside the United States. The third was creating an international church with regional conferences. The fourth was creating a World Methodist Conference of Churches. So, Cosmos considered a variety of solutions to the problems of its day. In the end, the UMC went with a combination of the first and second options. Some churches became fully autonomous, others stayed in the present central conference structure. We can perhaps see Cosmos as a missed opportunity to be more creative in finding ways to develop equitable connectional relationships across international differences, but it was nevertheless a time when the church dedicated significant focus to such questions, and it was still a step forward in that direction. Experimentation has continued since the time of Cosmos. In the 2000s, the worldwide nature of the UMC saw regionalization legislation passed in 2008, but not ratified. And that brings us to our current moment of regionalization, where worldwide regionalization legislation has passed and now is in the ratification process. So, regionalization has lots of historical precedents. Every few decades throughout the life of the United Methodist Church and its predecessors, there have been kairos moments when the church has sought anew to develop equitable relationships of Christian fellowship across countries. With the current regionalization legislation, we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to live into what God has been calling us to as a church for a long time. I hope you walk away from this webinar with 3 things. First, I hope you walk away assured of the strong theological basis behind the worldwide regionalization legislation. Second, I hope you walk away grateful for the gift God has given the church in the form of this current kairos moment. Third, I hope you walk away determined not just to support the worldwide regionalization legislation, but to figure out how we can, in all our ways as a denomination, live into the type of connectionalism to which God is calling us. So may it be. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you, Dr. Scott, for sharing this theological understanding of regionalization. Now, after we elected Reverend Dr. Elise Fulbright as the Secretary of the General Conference, she hit the ground running, having to transition to her new position while preparing the necessary infrastructure for a worldwide vote on constitutional amendments. We're so grateful for all that she's done to help prepare us for these various votes. And she now is going to help us understand the process and timeline for the passage of the regionalization amendments.
Greetings. My name is Reverend Dr. Elise Fulbright, and it is an honor to serve as your Secretary of the General Conference. As we lean into annual conference season, one of the primary business actions convened at each and every annual conference is the ratification of the constitutional amendments based on the actions of the postponed 2020 General Conference. As you may be aware, there were several actions that were convened and decided upon at General Conference, and the opportunity for lay and clergy to lend their voice and their vote is through the ratification process. Back in December, we, as the Office of the General Conference, worked with our bishops and annual conference secretaries to disseminate educational information related to the specific constitutional amendments that are up for ratification. That information can be found in collaboration with UMCom at resourceumc.org. Just type in constitutional amendments and you will see the information that had convened at General Conference, as well as the educational information that we have placed in distribution since December 2024. So many will ask, so what is this ratification process and what does it have to do with me? I'm glad you asked. So in our 2020-2024 Book of Discipline, paragraph 60, paraphrased in part, that our ratification process is canvassed by the bishops and it is an opportunity for lay and clergy to lend their voice and vote to the amendments, that the constitutional amendments within the United Methodist Church. Also understanding that this is the way in which our connection in collective is able to lend voice and vote regarding the future of our United Methodist Church. Paragraph 60 in part states that this is an aggregate vote that has to pass by a 2/3 majority of all annual conference members present and voting in order for there to be any amendments, in order for the amendments to take place. So such a few things for your consideration. We have been working with our Council of Bishops and the annual conference secretaries, for which they have an official certificate of action. And in that certificate of action, along with instructions, we have outlined how the vote could take place and should take place in each and every annual conference. 1, only those that are eligible to vote, lay and clergy who are in full connection and or equalization members, are eligible to vote. Additionally, the vote is at the discretion of the annual conference related to should it be electronic or should it be a paper ballot. Those instructions have been given regarding the various means of how the vote will be collected. Please know that there will be 4 separate votes, 4 separate ballots related to the decisions of General Conference and the constitutional amendments that must be ratified. Each vote will be open and closed respectively until the conclusion of voting. Please know within the voting process that each of these items can be debated but cannot be amended, as it will alter the decision of General Conference and that will be ruled out of order. If further amendments are needed and necessary, I would encourage you, when we open the portal for future legislation at a future General Conference, to exercise your right as a member of the United Methodist Church to further that legislation. There will be 4 separate votes, 4 separate ballots. On the first ballot, it will be all of the constitutional amendments related to regionalization. Those items are taken as an action of General Conference, for which you will see multiple constitutional amendments related to the actions of regionalization for which needs to be ratified. That will be vote number 1, ballot number 1. Vote number 2, ballot number 2, is related to paragraph number 4 regarding and titled The Inclusiveness of the Church. Please know that this particular paragraph has nothing to do with the former related to regionalization. These are 2 separate ballots, 2 separate votes related to those constitutional amendments. So the second ballot will be open. There will be opportunity to debate based on the debating policies and practices of your annual conference. The vote will be taken and will be closed. The third vote, the third ballot, will be around the racial justice from paragraph number 5 from the 2020-2024 Book of Discipline. Again, it will be open. There will be opportunity for debate. They will then close. The fourth ballot, the fourth vote, will be related to who is able to vote related to clergy delegates. And that is the fourth ballot, the fourth vote. It will be open. There will be opportunity for debate. The ballot will close and the vote will conclude. One of the important aspects of living out of paragraph 60 is that each every annual conference's decision is not publicized. Therefore, many will be inquiring regarding what is the outcomes of your specific annual conference, which will not be announced. And many will ask, well, why can we not know what our annual conference voted? Again, it is a 2/3 aggregate vote of all annual conferences persons who are present and voting. Therefore, it will be a challenge if one annual conference presents its outcomes and it is publicized with the assumption that that is the outcome of the United Methodist Church. Each presiding bishop and also annual conference secretary has been informed related to the opening and closing of each ballot, that at the conclusion of your voting, that no outcomes will be communicated. Please also note that this canvassing process starts as we begin annual conference season and has a timeline end of October 31, 2025, where myself and the Executive Secretary of the Council of Bishops, Bishop Gregory V. Palmer, will collate all of the information that we have received from the official certificates of actions, present it to the Council of Bishops for affirmation, and the entire United Methodist Church will be able to hear and know the results by the middle of November 2025, for which we will be able to share what the outcome of each and every vote, each and every ballot was. We will not disclose how each and every annual conference voted for the sake of the integrity of the process and because it is a 2/3 aggregate vote of each and every annual conference's members who are present and voting. Please know that we are working with and in collaboration with UMCom to ensure that each and every person has the educational information that is needed and necessary. We also know that our general secretaries, their boards, commissions, and agencies are actively involved in producing information that educates persons related to their respective constitutional amendment. So please, resourceumc.org could be your first place of trying to identify all the information that you need, as well as your annual conference secretary, and of course, your Episcopal office. We at the Office of the General Conference are here to serve you, and how best we can serve, we are here to do it. Thank you so much, and happy ratifying.
Many of us are used to seeing Heather Hahn's byline on articles published by News. We appreciate her work and the work of Taylor Burton Edwards, who's behind all of the wonderful information that has been shared via Ask the UMC. We're grateful that today they will share with us some practical benefits of regionalization. Now let us hear from Heather and Taylor.
I'm Reverend Taylor Burton Edwards with Ask the UMC, your United Methodist Information Service. My task here is to help you understand more clearly what the Regionalization Amendments package can do and not do, and what these amendments change and why, and what they do not change. You can see summaries of the legislation and the legislation itself online at http://www.resourceumc.org/regionalization. What I'm presenting is the PLDR, or the Cliffs Notes version of all of that. But before I get to what the legislation does and doesn't do, I want to underscore this point. The whole process of regionalization, including these amendments, has been a project of United Methodists everywhere since this initiative was launched by the actions of the 2012 General Conference that met in Tampa. The Connectional Table, itself a body with worldwide representation, had introduced a proposal and generated conversation about making the U.S. its own regional conference, like all the other regional conferences. That was kind of the foundation of this. Then a working group from the Philippines built on that proposal to flesh out a much more comprehensive vision of what regionalization could mean and what it could be. They called their proposal the Christmas Covenant. The Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters, with representatives from every Central Conference, then refined the Christmas Covenant into the package of legislation that ultimately passed the General Conference. And that included this package of constitutional amendments that's coming before your annual conference. It passed with just over 78% of the votes in favor at the 2024 General Conference. So, the support and the input that have brought us to this point have been worldwide, diverse, and affirmed by the overwhelming majority of the delegates from your conferences that were elected to the 2024 General Conference. So, what does regionalization legislation, these amendments in particular, do for the denomination and especially for General Conference? This package creates a level playing field where United Methodists in every region of the world have the same ability to adapt some parts of the discipline as are developed by each General Conference so that they can pursue the mission of the church better where they are. Put another way, regionalization is about letting each region, including the United States, make its own decisions about things that don't have to be the same worldwide. And it lets the General Conference discern which things do need to be the same worldwide and keep the focus of its work solely on those things. Once the provisions of these amendments are in full effect, which then also activates some other legislation that was passed by the General Conference depending on these amendments, matters that affect only the United States will no longer take any time on the floor or in the legislative sessions of the General Conference. Everything discussed at General Conference will be about things that affect all United Methodists everywhere. That means more time for more voices from more places, both in the legislative groups and on the floor of the General Conference. All of those people then have a reason to give input because everything matters to everyone in the room. Let me offer you this perspective as an agency staff member and observer of the past 5 General Conferences. I have sat with legislative groups and I've carefully watched the process of the proceedings of the plenary sessions at all of them. If you've been a delegate to General Conference or an observer yourself, you've probably also seen what I'm about to say. When matters that affect only the United States are on the floor, whether that's a legislative group or a plenary session, folks who are not from the United States are kind of left wondering what to do. We've brought them to a General Conference, literally made their travel arrangements and paid for them to be there. And on these things, and there are more of them than you can imagine if you've not been to a General Conference, they have nothing that they can really say. Folks, this is a terrific waste of their time and, frankly, your apportionment money. United Methodists can do better. And this package of constitutional amendments can help that happen. If United Methodists want General Conference to be freed up to focus solely on things that really matter for everyone, it has to be clearer than it has been what parts of the discipline can be adapted and more of the discipline has to be adaptable than was previously allowed. This package of constitutional amendments you are asked to consider is the necessary step to do that. These amendments enable each region to do itself these things that they did not have clear authority to do before. First, publish its own hymnal, its own book of worship, and a regional book of discipline. Second, set standards of character and expectations for lay membership and how to respond when laypersons do not fulfill them. Third, set qualifications and standards for ordained and licensed ministries, that is, deacons, elders, and local pastors. Fourth, set the qualifications and standards for specialized lay ministries, such as lay servant ministers, lay speakers, certified lay ministers, and other lay ministries. Fifth, set the standards for the organization and operation of annual conferences, district, and charge conferences within their bounds. Sixth, establish a regional judicial court to rule on questions arising from parts of the discipline that that region had adapted. So they can address those issues there and not bring those to the whole judicial council. Seventh, develop and specify how marriage ceremonies, funerals, and other rites are done within the shared understanding of Scripture and of the United Methodists have and the laws of each country. Eighth, make changes to chargeable offenses under church law. And ninth, work with annual conferences to ensure that the policies and practices that are adopted at the regional level also align with the laws in each country. This package of amendments gives regional conferences full authority over these matters for the good of all. And because these will be in the Constitution, these new rights of the regional conferences will come with extra protection. It'll take the same level of 2/3 vote of the General Conference, followed by 2/3 aggregate vote of all the annual conferences worldwide to alter these once they are set. All of that is what this package of amendments will change. So here are some things that will not change. First, some sections of the Book of Discipline will not be adaptable by regional conferences. Some of this is already the case. They include the Constitution, the denomination's doctrinal standards, such as our belief in Christ's resurrection, our statements on the ministry of all Christians and the social principles. The next General Conference will hear a final report from the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters that will create a new section of the discipline detailing all the items that are not already mentioned in those things that cannot be adapted by regional conferences, as well as another new section that clearly enumerates everything that can be adapted. What goes into each of those two sections is still being worked out. We'll hear more about that later. Second, among things that do not change, general conferences, the Council of Bishop, and the Judicial Council will continue to gather and make the decisions they need to make on behalf of their particular constituencies. Third, the general agencies will remain, and they will remain committed to supporting United Methodist congregations, conferences, and ministries wherever they are worldwide. Fourth, the 5 U.S. jurisdictions will remain just as they are. Jurisdictional conferences in the United States will continue to elect bishops in the United States. And fifth, General Conference will still have power over all matters that are distinctly connectional, things that matter to the whole church, and there are a whole lot of those. The General Conference has completed its part in deciding about these constitutional amendments. To pass, this package of amendments had to achieve at least a 2/3 vote of the members of the General Conference. It got just over 78.3% of all the votes of all the delegates. Your role as annual conferences is to decide whether to ratify what the General Conference has already approved. When it comes time for your annual conferences to vote this year, you will vote on whether to ratify all of this same package of regionalization amendments on a single ballot, just as the delegates of the 2024 General Conference did. I hope this brief overview helps you see clearly what will happen for United Methodists around the world and in the United States should enough United Methodists everywhere vote to ratify the General Conference's decision to pass this amendments package.
Thanks, Taylor. I'm Heather Hahn with United Methodist News, and my task here is to explain what happens if regionalization is not ratified. Simply put, what happens is the U.S. Church won't be able to change anything in the discipline without first winning the approval of General Conference, which has delegates from 4 continents. That difference between the U.S. and the central conferences is about to become more apparent. Since 2012, several groups of church leaders, at the behest of General Conference, have been working to comb through Part 6 of the Book of Discipline, trying to determine what applies worldwide and what can be adapted by the various central conferences. Part 6, which deals with administration and organization, is by far the biggest section of the discipline, at 663 pages. The group leading this endeavor is the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters, a permanent committee of General Conference. The Standing Committee expects to propose to General Conference in 2028 a new Part 6 that is slimmer and only contains provisions about administration that apply worldwide. That is, the parts that are non-adaptable in different regions of the world. The Standing Committee will propose that those provisions deemed adaptable will be moved to a new Part 7 that each central conference can adapt, or it can be adapted in the newly minted regional conferences, including the United States, if and only if annual conference voters ratify the regionalization amendment package. If regionalization does not receive enough votes, the new Part 7 can be adapted to the central conferences, but this part of the discipline will still apply in the U.S. Church in its entirety. As you can see, this is a major undertaking that now dates back more than a dozen years. The effort to create a general book of discipline that distinguishes between the adaptable and the non-adaptable will continue regardless of what happens with regionalization. If regionalization is not ratified, another change will become even more crucial. Last year's General Conference approved the creation of a new General Conference Legislative Committee that will deal with petitions that pertain solely to U.S. matters. This new U.S. Regional Committee will include all U.S. delegates to General Conference, as well as a lay and clergy delegate from each central conference. However, any piece of legislation this new committee supports will still need to go before the full General Conference plenary for approval. So the committee does not solve the problem of a U.S.-centric General Conference that spends much of its time on the concerns of just one country. But if annual conference voters ratify regionalization, the U.S. Regional Committee will cease to exist. Those who worked on regionalization see such a committee as unnecessary once a U.S. Regional Conference is formed. Bottom line, the goal of regionalization is fairness, so that General Conference can truly be a general conference that serves the whole church. Regionalization is also based on the well-established idea that most decisions should be made by those closest to where they will have the most effect. As many proponents of this legislation have said, the aim is to not put any one country at the center, but to put Christ at the center of our shared church life. I hope this brief overview helps explain how not voting for the regionalization package of amendments would affect the United Methodist Church. We look forward to your questions after my colleague Joe Iovino's presentation.
The regionalization legislation we've been discussing today is complex, and its benefits may not be immediately clear. Additionally, misinformation or assumptions may be shaping the conversation in your annual conference. And so it's crucial that we share what we're learning today with the voting members of our annual conferences so they can make informed decisions based on accurate information. Hi, I'm Joe Iovino, lead of the Denominational Content Strategy team at United Methodist Communications. And I'm excited to share with you today some of the amazing resources available to help you share with your annual conference what worldwide regionalization is, why it matters, and why each and every vote is important. Everything I'll discuss today can be found in one place, resourceumc.org/regionalization. When you type resourceumc.org/regionalization into your browser, it will take you directly to our page on worldwide regionalization, where we have compiled information and resources to share. At the very top of the page, you'll find a 3-minute video that opens with Bishop Tracy Malone sharing the goal of regionalization as being able to honor who we are as a worldwide denomination and to be able to honor the contextual, missional realities of each of our regions. The video continues with quotes from Bishop Harold Ruckert of the Germany Episcopal area and Bishop Christian Alstead of the Nordic Baltic Episcopal area, and leaders from the Philippines, the United States, and Africa, all sharing how regionalization will improve the effectiveness of outreach and ministries all across. To download this umc.org/regionalization and locate the video, which is called UMC Leaders Speak About Regionalization. Click on the download video button. Then, depending on your browser, there are 2 ways to download this video. In some browsers, you can simply right-click the video anywhere on it and select the Save Video option. In others, you may need to look in the bottom right corner of the page, where you'll see 3 stacked dots that when clicked will open up an options menu that includes a link to download the video. Now be sure to save the video in a place on your computer that is easy and convenient for you. We encourage you to use this video to introduce an audience to the importance of regionalization and why General Conference overwhelmingly supported it. As with all of our videos, you have permission to use this video in any way that will be most effective for you. Feel free to embed it on your website, share it in a newsletter, or use it during a presentation before or during annual conference. Also, you may want to use this video as inspiration for a similar video specific to your annual conference, using clips of your bishop talking about the importance of regionalization and members of your general conference delegation talking about why they voted for it, and perhaps other influential members of your annual conference talking about why they will be voting to ratify regionalization. A video like that could be incredibly influential as you approach your vote. Once we've established why regionalization matters, the next step is to help others understand the legislation itself and its impact. To assist with that, we've developed a couple of pieces that will inform voting members of your annual conference or members of local churches or your small group or Sunday school class or anyone else what worldwide regionalization is all about. The first and most easily consumable piece is a 1-page flyer called Regionalization, Effective Ministry in Every Culture. This downloadable document that was designed so that it can be printed on a single 8.5 by 11 letter-sized sheet of paper summarizes the legislation well and addresses some anticipated concerns. And the flyer is available in French, Korean, Portuguese, and Tagalog. As you can see on the screen, the material covered on the flyer is grouped into 4 general areas. First, an area called What is Regionalization, with 4 brief points to give an overview of what regionalization is, why it's important, the broad support it has, and a quick and brief summary of what it will look like. The second section we've included is about what regional conferences cannot do, which clarifies how our connection remains strong and reassures members that the tenets of our United Methodist beliefs remain the same. A third section shares what regional conferences can do, and that one illustrates just how powerful regionalization will be by sharing how areas of ministry can be adapted to fit any context. Examples used include worship aids, requirements for ordained ministry, standards for membership, and more. The final section at the bottom of the page, titled What Now?, shares an overview of the amendment process and tells of the need for ratification. As you can see, a lot of information is packed into this single-page document that could be used as a handout or as an outline or talking points when sharing about regionalization in an informal setting. To download this document, navigate to resourceumc.org/regionalization and look for Regionalization, Effective Ministry in Every Culture. When you click the link, you'll be redirected to a page where you'll see the English version of this one-page summary. If you'd like the flyer in another language, see the links to those pages in the sidebar on the right. And when you're ready, there are 2 ways to complete the download. You can right-click the Download, Share, and Print button, which will reveal a menu with the option to download the link. Click that, and your download should begin. Or you can click the Download, Share, and Print button as you normally would, and you'll be redirected to the download page for the flyer. Look for the Download button, the one in Chrome is at the top of the page, and save the document where you will be able to easily retrieve it. Again, this document is printable on letter-sized paper, but it can also be embedded on your website, shared on social media, included in an email to the voting members of your annual conference, or used as talking points or an outline for an informal setting when you share why you're voting to ratify regionalization. If you want to go deeper with your audience, we have just the thing for that too. A slide deck presentation you can use for either in-person or online gatherings. To access the slide deck, navigate to resourceumc.org/regionalization and click on Regionalization Presentation Slides for U.S. Annual Conferences, which will open a Google slideshow in a new tab on your browser. Now, we created this resource in Google Slides to make it easily customizable for different audiences, presentation formats, and time constraints. Whether you're a district superintendent presenting it to the clergy in your area or a pastor leading a discussion with a small group, however you plan to use the presentation, we encourage you to make it your own. To start customizing, the first step is to make a copy of the slideshow. I'll walk you through it quickly, but please note that there are instructions for how to do this on the very first slide. From the Google Slides page, click on File in the upper left corner, which will reveal a drop-down menu where you will see Make a Copy as an option. Hover over Make a Copy, and you'll then see an option to copy the entire presentation. The new copy will open in a new tab, and now you will have full edit permissions where you can delete slides, edit slides, or add information that will matter to your audience. There are several places where we've prompted you to add a quote from someone within your annual conference or other specifics that will be important to the people to whom you're presenting. The slideshow broadly follows the same outline as the handout. It opens with an introduction to the idea of regionalization that includes the Regionalization Effective Ministry in Every Culture video we talked about earlier, and several of the slides on the big ideas behind regionalization, how our benefits and structure will not be changed. It also shares on a single slide how the General Conference overwhelmingly supported the regionalization legislation, with 78% of the delegates voting in favor of it. Because we think the most influential stories are the ones that are about and from people in ministries we already know and care about, we've included a space for you to add a slide or several to talk about how ministries in your region will continue and be improved through regionalization. It's a way to celebrate the work your conference is already doing. The next section addresses in detail what regional conferences cannot do to assure members again that the tenets of our United Methodist beliefs remain the same. It then leads into a section about what regional conferences can do, which may be a great place for conversation around the ability to adapt the ministry to the people we're called to share the gospel with. It then concludes with a brief section about the ratification process and offers an opportunity for you to add a quote from your bishop, general conference delegates, or other influential leaders in your annual conference sharing why they will be voting to ratify regionalization. As I reflect on these presentation slides, I'm struck by how their adaptability to a specific audience or structure serves as a small illustration of regionalization. Just as we adjust a presentation to make it most effective for the people we are ministering to in that moment, regionalization allows the church to adapt ministry to better serve communities around the world. Now, before we move on to the next section, I want to be sure you're aware of some other resources available at resourceumc.org/regionalization. First, the information that you're receiving in this webinar today will be available in the coming days. The presentations you have seen will be posted, offering opportunity for you to revisit David's theological insights and Heather and Taylor's information about regionalization and everything else that you've heard today. Be sure to return to the site for that in the days ahead. Another helpful resource available at resourceumc.org/regionalization is Ask the UMC's What is Regionalization series, which I found to be an excellent primer on the topic. While you may choose to share it as an additional resource, I highly recommend reviewing it for yourself and with others who may be presenting throughout your annual conference. It provides valuable insight into how regionalization will function and highlights the ways the principles of regionalization are already at work. Taylor offers compelling examples of how the Central Conference's ability to adapt the discipline has not been a barrier to unity, but has instead strengthened ministry's effectiveness around the world. Having working knowledge of this information will be invaluable when answering questions or addressing misinformation. Another one-page summary document called Regionalization Summary of General Conference Decisions is also available. This is an excellent summary of the regionalization legislation that was produced by the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters, the Connectional Table, the Council of Bishops, and done in partnership with the Christmas Covenant. This is an appropriate resource to share with those who are most deeply in tune with the polity of the United Methodist Church, so be sure to take a look at that. You might want to share it. In addition to the voting members of your annual conference understanding what regionalization is and why it matters, you will also want to be sure that they are aware of the process of ratification, how important their vote will be, and to encourage them to attend the annual conference session to vote in favor of ratification. We have several resources that you'll find helpful in sharing this information as well. A great starting point is our concise 1-minute video designed to explain the ratification process clearly. The video, while not specific to regionalization, offers an overview of the constitutional amendment process. It begins by defining what the Constitution and the Book of Discipline are, and then explains the process for amendments from General Conference petition and approval through the ratification process and finalizing when the Council of Bishops can announce that the amendment has become church law. All of this is presented in just 59 seconds in a way that is easily to comprehend. To find this video, go again to resourceumc.org/regionalization. Scroll down to the resources section and click on How is the United Methodist Constitution Amended? Download the video by clicking on the Download Video button, which, as with all of our videos, will open that new page where the video is stored. You can begin your download by right-clicking anywhere on the video and selecting Save Video As. If that option is not available to you because of your browser, you may need to click on the 3 dots in the lower right corner and then select Download. Be sure to save the video in a location on your drive that is convenient and easy to find. This video is suitable and available for placement on your website, to share on social media, to embed in an e-newsletter, to include in a presentation, or to link to in an email correspondence with your voting delegates. As with all of the videos available through United Methodist Communications, you have our permission to use the video in any way that will be helpful to you as you share this important information. For those who prefer reading over watching a video, we have an article about the ratification process that shares the same information. It's called Amending the United Methodist Constitution and is also available in the resources section of umc.org/regionalization. You may want to include it as an additional resource you share for people to take home with them after a presentation. This document may also be printed or saved as a PDF by clicking the print button at the top of the page. We're also developing an additional resource that's not quite ready yet, but it will address the aggregate vote count. Unlike other annual conference votes, constitutional amendments require an aggregate 2/3 majority. So understanding how every vote contributes to the overall outcome is essential. The centerpiece of this page will be a hypothetical illustration that emphasizes how important every vote is and why it's important for every voting delegate to vote yes, even if they feel certain that their annual conference will approve ratification of regionalization. As you can see in this draft, our illustration shows 5 hypothetical conference vote totals. In the top chart, the amendment gets 2/3 approval in 3 of the 5 annual conferences, but fails to reach the 66.67% threshold in aggregate. The chart below it shows how just 6 more yes votes across those 5 hypothetical conferences would have changed the outcome. This page will also be easy to print and share as an additional resource to add as part of a take-home packet after a presentation, or a link to share when you're reaching out to the voting members of your annual conference. When available, you'll be able to access this resource called Every Vote is Important: Your Role in Constitutional Amendments in the Resources section of resourceumc.org/regionalization. Finally, our creative strategy team is working on a marketing campaign to help you get out the vote in your annual conference. That too will be available at resourceumc.org/regionalization at a later date. If you have questions or suggestions about any of the resources that I've presented to you today, please email me and our team at resourceumc@umcom.org. The key takeaway for these past several minutes is simply this: everything you will need is at resourceumc.org/regionalization. Thank you.
We're so grateful for all the collaborative partnerships across our beloved denomination that have led to the development of all of our resources that we now have available for us to use. We have actually been able to develop and refine many of those resources because of feedback we received during various training events that we've held around the world. Your questions will help us further refine many of these resources. So if you have any questions after having heard all the presentations, we're happy to entertain those questions now. Heather Hahn is going to serve as the moderator during this period of question and answers. Now remember, if we don't get to your specific question, know that we will use your question and others to continue to modify the resources that are available to you. So keep checking in, keep checking on our resources as they are frequently updated as we receive questions and feedback from you.
Hi, everybody. So just so you know, you've gone from recording to live, and we're so grateful to you all for participating. And we're very grateful because a lot of you actually sent your questions in advance. And so I hope all my colleagues who are part of this conversation will be unmuted and with their videos live. And we are here. And I will just warn you, we have gotten way more questions than we can answer, but this will be something we will try to get to as much as we can. So my very first question is for Bishop Moore-Cocoy. If every region is making changes to the discipline that are cultural, what will keep the denomination united when each region could look so different?
Thank you so much for that question. That's a great question. We've heard this question many times throughout our training events. And the things that will keep us united are centered around our theology, our understanding of who God is as Methodist, and centering around those foundational doctrines that are found in the beginning of our book of discipline. That really fuel the lens through which we do mission and ministry. So we will be united around what it is to have a Wesleyan theology. We'll be united around what it is to be in mission and ministry in a world in a way that uses that theology as its foundation. There is so much that unites us in our understanding of who God is and how God wants us to be in the world. And being able to focus on that, I think, will help us to be more effective in doing our mission and ministry contextually.
Thank you so much. Dr. Fulbright, you have already kind of touched on the fact that we will not announce voters, but I wanted to ask, how many votes each annual conference will have. But I wanted to ask, what is the actual math needed to get to that 2/3 aggregate vote? What is the percentage we will need?
Great. Thank you, Heather, for the question. The math is a little more complicated than just X plus Y equals Z, I would offer, because as paragraph 60 suggests, that it is the aggregate votes of all annual conference members present and voting. So for those who are voting, all of that will be captured on a certificate of action by the annual conference secretaries, signed and authenticated by the presiding bishop and the annual conference secretary. That information will be received, and we will be keeping a spreadsheet of each and every member present and voting throughout the entire ratification process. For then we need 2/3, which is the 66%. And so we will be monitoring it throughout the annual conference season. And Executive Secretary of the Council of Bishops, Bishop Gregory V. Palmer, and I will consult before we present to the Council of Bishops in November.
Do you mind repeating when we can expect to know the final results?
The canvassing is through this season of annual conference, which will conclude October 31, 2025. That has been communicated in and throughout the Council of Bishops, for which when they convene at their fall meeting, the information will be presented and affirmed, and therefore we will then know what the outcomes will be for the worldwide United Methodist Church.
Another question about voting. We've heard that in some annual conferences, people can have the right to abstain from the vote. How is an abstention vote counted? And can you abstain from voting on a constitutional amendment?
Great question, and that has been a question of many inquiries over the last several weeks and months. So the determination is that it is, as paragraph 60 suggests, present and voting. So your abstention is your choice to not vote, therefore it will not be captured. So we are only capturing those that are affirmative, yes and or no. Those that are choosing to abstain is choosing to not vote.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that clarity. Reverend Burton Edwards, How will regionalization affect annual conferences and jurisdictions?
So this actually is not related to the constitutional amendments package that annual conferences are being ratified directly. It is related indirectly because petition 8 that was brought to the general conference through the standing committee and also previously through the Christmas covenant process called for the creation, assuming these constitutional amendments happen, of a special study to look at some of these ongoing issues that aren't really being addressed directly by the regionalization legislation, including the future of jurisdictions more broadly and more specifically within the United States. This is going to be a special study that's conducted between the Connectional Table and the Standing Committee, which will then be called the Standing Committee on Regional Conferences on a Worldwide Basis, or regional conferences outside the U.S. Those two bodies, the Connectional Table and the Standing Committee on Regional Conferences outside the U.S., to have a thorough discussion and exploration of these questions and bring legislation back to the 2028 General Conference to address what happens, what they are recommending should happen with jurisdictions both in the US and worldwide, whether they're still needed, if so, what kinds of additional kinds of legislation needs to be introduced to address what is perceived to be an appropriate need. And as the Connectional Table and the Standing Committee always do, there will always be opportunity for input into that process from others around the world to share their thoughts and opinions as the work is ongoing. Just always kind of share that out and help there to be some thought about that before it comes to general conference. The other thing is a question about what happens to annual conferences. Annual conferences stay as they are. Annual conferences are not directly impacted by this legislation in any real way, except perhaps in the US, if there is ultimately, not in this legislation, but in whatever happens in 2028, a recommendation approved to eliminate jurisdictional conferences, then the US Regional Conference would in fact be on complete parity with all the others as being the body that essentially creates and approves annual conferences and establishes where all of their boundaries are. Right now, that's work that's being done by jurisdictional conferences.
And relatedly, I guess, could this committee potentially that's going to be looking at the future of jurisdictions, could it look at how successful regionalization is and whether it needs to be perfected?
In theory, they could do that. I think the reality is it's going to be early days for what's happening with regionalization throughout this quadrennium. What we're actually looking at with regionalization legislation that we're being asked to consider right now will start to go into effect perhaps as early as next year really technically as soon as the announcement of ratification is done, it will go into effect. But practically, making all those things happen is going to take a little while. So we're probably in better stead to be thinking about evaluation of how things are going toward the end of this quadrennium and really into the next quadrennium to kind of get a sense of what we're learning from the process. Something that's always important to realize about United Methodists is that conferencing matters, because it's not a question of do this fixes it, and that's the end of it forever. Every general conference, the fundamental thing it does is to make changes to make things better than they were from the previous general conference. And so the same kind of thing will happen with this. There will be ongoing evaluation as the process is unrolling, because there'll be ongoing learning about what's happening and what's not happening and how could we help things happen better. So this is really, it just kind of rolls into overall general process of what a general conference does, which is to think about how do we make our whole process work more efficiently and more effectively toward the bottom line mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world.
So in an inordinate way, I'm going to take on two of the questions that we've gotten. One, I just wanted to remind folks what the Christmas covenant is, since it keeps coming up. And we've gotten questions about that. So basically, this is how we got here. It started with the Connectional Table. They came up with the legislation to have the U.S. Regional Conference. And the Christmas Covenant was a group of delegates and other leaders in the central conferences, specifically and predominantly in the Philippines and Africa, as well as Europe, who basically said, okay, we like this regional conference idea. Let's use similar terminology and have parity and turn all the central conferences into regional conferences too. That became their legislation. And the Standing Committee, lastly, and why it's called the Christmas Covenant, I should add, is that it was introduced in December 2019, the goal of this. So this was already done before General Conference was delayed, and both these pieces of legislation were together. Now we're coming to the delayed General Conference of 2024, last year. And before that, the Standing Committee looked at the plan coming from the Christmas Covenant and looked at the folks' Connectional Table and said, there has to be a way to put all this together in one package so it's very clear that these are all setting the same goals. So the Standing Committee created a task force that included folks who helped draft the Christmas Covenant, as well as members of the Connectional Table and the Standing Committee itself, to basically refine that legislation. And that was what was brought before General Conference, and that is what is before you now. But the Christmas Covenant basically took what was a U.S. idea and made it worldwide. So they're really critical, and I want to celebrate their work. The other question that I'm taking, because I cover money stuff, is where will the funds to hold general conferences come from? Well, the answer to that is that for the regional conferences outside the U.S. will be funded basically the same way central conferences are now, which is funding basically that comes from both the central conferences themselves and global ministries. Work is ongoing to create a sustainable funding model for regional conferences or central conferences for decades to come. Now, the U.S. Regional Conference, being new, would obviously be a bit different. Last year's General Conference approved non-disciplinary legislation to create an interim committee to form a U.S. Regional Conference. This committee is separate from the U.S. Regional Committee, that is a General Conference Legislative Committee that I referred to in my presentation. Anyhow, the interim committee is to have 20 to 25 members named by the Council of Bishops, with a minimum of 3 members from each of the 5 jurisdictions. Funding for this committee's meetings and related costs will come from the General Administration Fund, whose overall budget was already approved by General Conference last year. The interim committee is forecast to need funding of between $83,000 and $98,000, and the committee would only meet for this one quadrennium and not beyond. So that takes care of how we get to creating a regional conference. Well, how much will they cost going forward? Well, ultimately, the hope is that the creation of regional conferences worldwide will lead to a shortened general conference. General conference will still be necessary, but we're hoping it could be a little bit shorter, and that will actually result in some serious cost savings for the General Administration Fund that also supports general conference. The drafters of regionalization understand that increasing apportionments is not feasible. So rest assured, we're going to find the funding. So anyhow, with all that, I want to turn to David Scott, Dr. Scott, who's got a lot of wealth of information. What parts of the world does regionalization apply to? And who determines what is right for the context of an area?
Thanks, Heather, and thanks to whoever submitted that question. So regionalization applies to all parts of the world where there are branches of the United Methodist Church. That's sort of one of the points of the regionalization legislation, is that it would apply across the board and not make distinctions between regions. There are differences in how much things will shift in different regions. As I was talking about earlier, because of the U.S.-centric nature of how the church is currently, the impact of the legislation in the U.S. will be a little bit different than it is elsewhere, but the goal is to have the legislation apply across the board and to move towards greater equity across the board. As for who determines what's right for the context of an area, I mean, that's the various forms of leadership, whether that's Episcopal leadership, conferences as a form of collective leadership at the various levels of the United Methodist Church. And that starts, all the way from the local church, where the church council and the pastor get to decide how best that church is going to be in ministry in the particular context of that context. District conferences, annual conferences, Episcopal areas, regional conferences, and so on.
Do churches in that area have to abide by what is decided in a region, even if they do not agree?
Well, as I'm sure everyone has some experience of in their lives, there is always the letter of the law and then people's actions, and sometimes those coincide. Often we hope those coincide, and sometimes there's a gap for a variety of reasons. I mean, the conferences will have the ability to set that law, to set those guidelines for the church. How universally those are lived out is probably a question of human nature and realities on the ground.
Well, thank you so much. Dr. Fulbright, I want to go back to the U.S. Regional Committee, which is that new legislative committee at General Conference that, frankly, General Conference already passed. It's in paragraph 507 of the 2020-24 Book of Discipline. That paragraph states that it immediately takes effect upon the close of 2024 General Conference. How does the Commission on the General Conference interpret that paragraph? Basically, when can this committee start meeting?
Great question. The commission will be taking this matter up at their next meeting in May and also in November of 2025 to further dissect what the parameters are related to paragraph 507, and then being able to put the necessary procedures in place so that we can ensure that we're, one, following the Book of Discipline, two, it will be a different iteration than what we're accustomed to. So it takes a little while for, one, our new commission members to be able to understand, and then to further figure out how we're going to implement it. So more to come.
Reverend Iovino, are there any strategies for communicating with others about how important this is that you would recommend?
Yeah, there are two strategies come to mind. The first is focus on the local. The most influential people to talk about regionalization and the importance of it in your annual conference are you and the other members of your annual conference. So I would platform your bishop and your general conference delegation and have them talk about what they heard during general conference about why regionalization is important. And then I would also ask the delegates to share why they voted in favor of regionalization in Charlotte. I'd also consider recruiting some influential members of your annual conference to talk about why they're voting for ratification of regionalization. We know that sometimes we vote with people we know and trust. And so recruiting those people and having them share why they're voting for it can be very powerful. The second strategy, I think, is to keep it simple, or at least start there. It's easy to get lost in the details of regionalization. This vote is on a series of amendments, and there's a lot in it that can get complicated, especially to those who are not as familiar with how the worldwide United Methodist Church functions. So in other words, I wouldn't lead with details. I'd lead with the outcomes and how the regionalization plan was developed in cooperation with so many United Methodists across the globe, as you've heard several times here today, and the overwhelming support that it received from the General Conference, that 78% in favor of it. And then get in the details when you're asked about them. And remind those asking about the details that they're not going to have opportunity at annual conference to perfect the motion, as a lot of our annual conferences tend to get involved in. Amendments are out of order. They're not going to be able to do that. This is a yes or no vote. So that's mine. I would definitely platform your voting members. Platform the members your voting members already know, and share the plan in a way that's as easy to understand as possible.
Thank you so much. Bishop Okonkwo, I'm going to go back to you again, if you don't mind. How will regionalization in the UMC avoid the kinds of divisions that plague the Anglican Communion? For example, the openly gay Bishop Gene Robinson was not welcomed in all Anglican provinces around the world. Under regionalization, what guarantees all United Methodist bishops will have their general superintendency recognized?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for bringing the ecumenical question into this conversation. I first want to make sure that we understand the nature of the Anglican Communion. Our equivalent of the Anglican Communion is the World Methodist Council. The World Methodist Council is made up of 80 different Methodist denominations. And those 80 denominations, in order to be a part of the World Methodist Council, have all agreed that they would respect the other member denominations, that they would respect their polity, they would respect their theology, that they would respect their way of being in mission in the world. You have to declare that you will respect the other member churches or denominations in order to be a part of the World Methodist Church. So that is a gathering of different churches or denominations. Regionalization is about one denomination that is a member of the World Methodist Council. I want to make sure that everyone is clear that regionalization is not creating different denominations that will be members of the United Methodist Church. We will remain one denomination. So a bishop that's elected in a jurisdiction in the US, a bishop that's elected in Africa or in Europe will be a bishop of the United Methodist Church and will receive the same respect that bishops of the United Methodist Church receive at the World Methodist Council. You know, one of the things that I love about our connection is the way that culturally we're able to understand things better. So when I travel in Africa, everywhere I go in the United Methodist Church, people will say, "That's my bishop." My bishop. They have an ownership of me as a bishop because they recognize that I am a bishop of the entire denomination. That's one of the gifts that we have from our connection. And so regionalization will not change that. Regionalization will preserve the fact that if you're elected as a bishop in the United Methodist Church, by whatever rules your particular region has for election, you will remain a bishop. And I also just want to share, because it's sometimes in the US context, we don't have a clear understanding of what happens in other places in our connection. Bishops are elected in a different manner in other places in the United Methodist Church. The bishops in the Philippines, for example, have to be elected again after they get elected the first time. Bishops in Europe are only elected for a certain term in the United Methodist Church. So we already have differences around the election process, and each one of those bishops still remains a bishop of the United Methodist Church collectively. So I hope that that gives an answer to that question, Heather. If there's any other questions that come from that, I'd be glad to answer them.
Absolutely. Well, I've got another question for you about regionalization, and it
Okay.
actually is about how it intersects with another constitutional amendment coming before voters. If regionalization is ratified, how do the changes to paragraph 4, which deals with inclusion, relate to regionalization? How does the requirement, specifically, how does the requirement to admit members, regardless of their gender or ability, work with the regionalization's allowance of each regional conference to set standards of character for membership?
Great. Thank you. Thank you so very much. As Taylor explained in his wonderful information he provided about the practical implications of regionalization, there will be certain things that we will not be able to alter region by region. And our understanding of humanity, our understanding of God's creative power and our diversity is one of those things that Dr. Scott explained as part of our foundational theology that cannot be altered. So our understanding of God, including all of us, male, female, they and them in our creation, that's one of the things that cannot be altered, and so therefore cannot be considered in terms of membership. Our ability level should be one of those things that should not be considered in our membership because we believe it's foundational to our understanding of who God is and how God has created us to be in the world. And so this process of regionalization will allow us to continue as a collective denomination to wrestle with those things that we believe are foundational and therefore cannot be altered by the regions, cannot be differentiated region by region, are not contextual, but rather are foundational to who we are and our understanding of who God created us to be. We'll be able to continue to wrestle with that, but that is why it's something that will be codified in our Constitution, rather than something that's open to regionalization changing or modifying in some way.
Absolutely. Well, I have one more question for you, and I just fair warning, I'm going to ask two more questions. Bishop, if regionalization is ratified, how long would it take to implement?
That's a loaded question. So the first answer to that question is it will be implemented immediately upon certification of the vote by the Council of Bishops in conjunction with our Secretary to General Conference. That's the first answer to the question. The second answer to the question is that we know that everything takes time. So it will take time for us to build the structures that are needed to support this new way of being. And so there are some structures that we won't realize until 2028 at that general conference. There'll be some structures that, again, we will realize the next day after the council announces the vote. The other answer to that question is that some of us have already started living into the spirit of regionalization. And I'll give you an example of that. The Council of Bishops has altered its agenda to live into the spirit of regionalization. Before this past general conference, the African bishops had a time where they would meet together and discuss issues that were pertinent to serving as a bishop on the continent of Africa. The bishops serving in Europe met during the Council of Bishops meeting to talk about their issues. Our folks in the Philippines met, but they always had to steal time away from the regular agenda. And they had to be present while the US bishops talked about issues that only dealt with the US. We've started to reformulate our agenda so that there now is a time on our agenda when the US bishops meet, our African bishops meet, our European bishops meet, and our Filipino bishops meet all at the same time in different locations so that we can discuss those issues that only pertain to those regions. We've already started doing that. So to answer your question, formally, we got to wait till the vote happens. And there are some things that will start right after that, but we've already started living into this because, as I said in my introduction, we really do believe this is where God is calling us to be. And as bishops, sometimes you got to go where God is calling you, even if the church hasn't already blessed it.
Absolutely. Well, this is our last question. Reverend Iovino, how can we help to dispel and counter any misinformation about regionalization?
I'm grateful for this question also, as many have said, because addressing misinformation can be really tricky, right? Because sometimes when we address it, we inadvertently lend it credibility because people hear it again. And so when we were dealing with misinformation around disaffiliation a couple of years ago, I read this article in Psychology Today about something called the illusory truth effect. So bear with me for a second here, which in essence says that frequent exposure to information leads to information sounding true, even if it initially didn't sound true. So as we continue to be exposed to the information, it gets credibility or gets to be, like, again, sounding like it's true. And so these experts reminded us that people tend to remember the first and the last thing you say. And often when we address misinformation, we start by saying, you may have heard this, it's not true, so don't believe it, right? So we our first thing we say is the misinformation, and the last thing we say is the misinformation. And so they ask us to flip that. That's the recommendation. So in essence, to say, this is what regionalization is, then acknowledge the misinformation. You may have heard this, and then conclude saying, again, but regionalization actually is this. That's a much more effective way of presenting or presenting a counter narrative to any misinformation. So the short answer broadly is talk far more about what regionalization is rather than what it's not. And when you have to address misinformation, lead with the truth, acknowledge the misinformation, and then summarize again with the truth for emphasis. And so that would be my recommendation of how to address misinformation that's floating in your annual conference. I hope that's helpful.
Absolutely. Joe, I'll just share with our readers, our participants, that in journalism, we call that a truth sandwich, and we do it a lot in my profession. Anyhow, I am so grateful to you all, and I want to thank you so much for your time today and your questions. And we received many more questions today than we were able to answer during our time together, but we will be reviewing those and creating content to address as many of those as possible. And as we said before, you can find this webinar, the presentations, and more resources at resourceumc.org/regionalization. Please keep checking for new sources, as we will be adding those soon. Both resourceumc.org and my home, umnews.org, will also both continue to have more information on regionalization. I'll give it back to Bishop Moore Coy Coy, who will close us out.
I want to thank all of our presenters for all that they've shared today. We are just so blessed by your giftedness. And I want to thank all of those who have joined this webinar. Thank you so very much for your answer of yes and your willingness to serve. I look forward to us getting regionalization passed. And I wonder, is there a video also that needs to be shown for the conclusion of this? Thank you all, and praise God for your participation in this training event. What a blessing it has been to hear from each one of our presenters as they have shared their gifts, pertinent information, and resources with us, with the church. They did their work in preparation for this event, and they now lovingly pass the work to you so that you can do the work of developing and executing a plan to get regionalization overwhelmingly approved in your annual conference. We will do this work together. Our presenters will continue to resource you. We will continue to contact you with updates as they become available. And we urge you to actively check for information and updates on the resources that Joe shared with you. I am so looking forward to the celebration that is going to take place when our beloved denomination takes a step towards decolonization by ratifying regionalization. I also praise God for the collaboration that this event represents. I'm grateful to Bishop Tracy Malone. I'm grateful to Bishop Monday Miyombo. I'm grateful to Bishop Harold Ruckert. I'm grateful to Judy Keniston and Jennifer Rodier, to Roland Fernandez, and to the writers of the Christmas Covenant, and so many others who agreed to work together on this. And now, since you have been invited into this collaboration, I know we will get this done. We will get the amendments ratified in Jesus' name. Amen.